Hey everyone, Cahlen here, and in this video I'm going to talk about the occult and why people are so afraid of it unnecessarily. So basically the occult means hidden. Occult knowledge is just knowledge which some people have on this planet, which they keep out of the hands of most of the other people on the planet, mostly for the purpose of controlling them in some way. Okay, so a lot of people have the idea that the occult is bad. And there are a lot of things that you can do bad with the knowledge that is contained with the occult. Just like any tool, there's a lot of bad things that you could do with a knife. There's also a lot of good things you could do with a knife that are good, right? Or a computer, or all kinds of, you could just basically list this on and on and on. So the occult is the same way. But there are some things which, for example, spiritualism or communicating with disembodied spirits. First of all, the belief, the knowledge that there are such things as disembodied spirits and they can be communicated with through various means and strategies, that's obviously occult. Christians and Abrahamists and some of the other religions are aware of that actually exists, but they're not willing to communicate with spirits. Basically it's just kind of a tenet. Anyone who's communicating with the spirits is basically doing evil, unless you're communicating with the Holy Spirit or with Jesus or with God. But these are just other spirits. So basically, Christians, for example, are hypocrites. They have all kinds of occult rituals. If you go to church, you're participating in all kinds of deeply occult rituals, including blood, human sacrifice, human cannibalism, blood drinking, if you're a Catholic, okay? So they demonize the occult even though they're participating and doing all the worst aspects of what the occult is, okay? So let's talk about a bad aspect, like I said, spiritualism, talking with spirits. Now, it's not that talking with a disembodied spirit is necessarily a bad thing. I would say most spirits in the universe are probably not out to get you, out to use you, out to hurt you. But most spirits who are open to communicating with a human, who are even interested in that, most of those are not good ones, right? What they're trying to do is to get something from you, and it doesn't matter to them if it hurts you or hurts the people in your life, okay? So because most of the spirits who want to communicate with humans are bad, it's generally not a good idea to communicate with spirits. And I have a rule for myself that I don't communicate with disembodied beings, okay? Now, like I said, I don't necessarily think it's bad. And, at some point, I may change my mind about that, but at the moment, I think it's a good rule. It's just like, look, I've decided I only want to be having interaction with actually embodied beings. That's how I'm tuning the experience of my life, and I think it's going to keep me safer than a lot of the other people who are playing around with this type of stuff, which I think is a bad idea. So anyways, there's an aspect of the occult where people see it as bad, and I think that it's somewhat justified. Okay. Now, there's other aspects of the occult which are they are occult, but knowing about it there's nothing wrong with it. And honestly, you really couldn't, if you had the knowledge, you really couldn't do anything bad with it, or it would be hard to do something bad with it, unless what you were doing was keeping it occulted from other people. And then, of course, you could do something bad. So an example, most humans didn't always know that solar eclipses were a natural thing that happened on a natural schedule and what was actually going on there, okay? So because there were some people who did know that, and they knew when it would happen, they knew how long it would last, and they knew why, and all this type of stuff, they chose to keep that knowledge away from the population because they could use that knowledge against the population. So for example, let's say that some priest group is trying to convince, on behalf of some god or disembodied spirit perhaps, or maybe an actual embodied spirit who's just really powerful, on behalf of this being is trying to convince a population of people to accept the sacrifice of all firstborn children or something like that, right? Now, obviously the population's not going to be down with that. They're going to resist that. That's going to be like the least exciting thing that anyone would want. Okay, to have to give away their child for whatever purpose, probably, death. So the priests know that they will not like this idea, but they still want it to happen. And so they can use something like the knowledge of an eclipse to convince the population to go along with it. So if you know when the eclipse is going to happen, you can planting this idea in the heads of the people and saying, you know, if we don't go along with this, the gods have told me there's going to be consequences. You know, it's going to be really bad. And then people are like, no, sorry, we're not going along with this, okay? So make sure that when the eclipse is going to happen, you're in a place in the public where you have access to a large group of people. It starts happening, the eclipse starts, and you can start your whole thing. You're like, oh, I told you the God said this and that, and the sun gets totally eclipsed, and everyone's like, you know, the sun is life, the sun is the source of all life. The people think the sun has just been destroyed. And you can be like, hey, you know, the only way that we can be saved from this, from the God's wrath, is if you accept what I've been telling you about, which is to allow, basically, integrate into your society the sacrifice of firstborn children. Okay, and so basically in the few minutes where the sun is up in the sky and getting covered by, and everyone's freaking out and crying, you can have this big long spiel, you get them to accept it, and then once they, you know, they're still going to be like, we don't really like this idea, but you know, we're all going to die, so we accept it, and then after they accept it, they think because they accept it, the sun comes back, right? But the priest knew that was going to happen anyways, okay? So now you've really got these people hooked for generations at this point, because people are going to be telling this story to their kids, okay? So this is an example of how occulting truth can be used to control a population. And there's all kinds of examples like this. For example, chlorine dioxide is something which will cure you of most issues. If everyone knew about chlorine dioxide and was using it, then nothing like a COVID-19 or vaccinations or any of that stuff could ever be used on you. They wouldn't be able to dumb you down and get you sick with all these other things, because the chlorine dioxide by itself is going to counteract a lot of the damage that all the other stuff is doing, like the air, the EMF, and all this type of stuff. So keeping chlorine dioxide is something which is basically unknown, right? Most people these days don't know that chlorine dioxide cures most things. And there is science on it, but people don't know this, and you can actually just do it yourself, and you're going to discover that it works basically on everything. But they don't want you to know this because they can't control you through all those different avenues anymore. They can't weaken you in all of those ways, okay? So another example of something kind of similar to the eclipse thing, which is still going on today. So we might think, oh, that's silly, those people didn't know that eclipses occurred. Well, we have kind of a similar situation. Like the sun has cycles based on what other stuff is going on around it, what's going on inside of it. Those cycles are known and regular, and they influence the weather, and also they sometimes lead to solar flares, which cause cataclysms on the planets in the solar system. Okay, and this is just something that happens on a regular schedule. But you don't know about it. You probably think that I'm wrong about it. You probably think I'm crazy. But this is just something that is the way it is. There are people, just like with the eclipse thing, there are people who know that this is the way it is. They plan all of their plans around it. Like for the next couple of decades, we're basically in a plan to harvest as much as possible from humanity before they all go down into their bunkers and let the rest of humanity get destroyed by the cataclysm, and then everything will start all over again, okay? So the reason they are going to be able to pull off all of these things on you, for example, the climate change hoax, all this type of stuff, is because they know about this stuff ahead of time. And they can, because you don't know about it, they can manipulate things. And again, they can also, for example, they can control the weather. This is occulted knowledge, that they can control the weather. The weather has been controlled for decades at this point, okay? And they can use that, the fact that you don't know it, and so therefore you just think that everything happened is just kind of a natural phenomenon. They can make it look like the climate is changing even more than it is due to the sun to get you even more freaked out, okay? So again, those are just all examples of how to control people. One of the main reasons why there is even such a thing as the occult, okay? So another thing which is occulted is basically that the only actual law in terms of like moral law, in terms of your behavior, the choices you make, is that you can do whatever you want as long as you don't harm anyone. And that's the only law. Now you may think something like, oh, you get to stop at a red light, or you can't cross the street, that those things are laws, but those things are just statutes, or in other words, they're just contractual agreements or rules that you agreed to follow by becoming a member of an organization. Your government is just an organization, that's all it is, there's nothing special about it. And it has rules, and when you voluntarily become a member by getting a social security number or having a bank account or having a driver's license, you're agreeing to follow all those rules, and that's just a contract. Those aren't actual laws, okay? The only law, if you were to remove yourself from that corporation like I have, the only law which I am subject to is do no harm. Do whatever I want as long as I do no harm, okay? And that actually kind of brings me to another thing, which is how the occult is demonized even when it's talking about good things. Okay, so you think about someone like Aleister Crowley, who people generally think of as being an evil guy. This guy wasn't evil. He lived a very unusual life, and he did a lot of things that you probably would never have done. But most of those things that he said and did were not bad and were not evil. Now, he did do some things which I think were highly questionable, and maybe you could even call them evil. For example, summoning a demon, which was probably a really bad idea. But that doesn't mean that everything that he said was bad, okay? So one of the things that people say that he says to prove that he's a bad guy is they say that the rule for the group that he started called Dilemma is do what thou will is the whole of the law. So basically people think, oh, what he's saying is you can just do whatever you want. That's the new rule. Just do whatever you want. But that's not what he's saying. It's like the opposite, in fact, of what he's actually saying. If you actually understand Thelema, which is the organization he started, it's all about the will, and there's two wills. There's the lowercase w will, which is your will, and then there's the uppercase w will, which is God's will, and he's basically saying, he's talking about God's will in that situation, okay? He's talking about having your will in alignment with God's will, because that is the secret to this universe, okay? So it's basically being on mission, right? If you are on mission, it's something that you want to be doing and that you feel called to do, and you feel like it's in your bones. Like before you were even born, that was something that you were going to do. That's what it's like to be in alignment with the uppercase W will. And that's what he's talking about there. And in fact, they leave out things. So it says, do what thou will would be the whole of the law. And then something, I think it's like love is the law. I can't remember exactly what it is. But basically, you can look it up. Okay, so it's do what thou will be the whole of the law. Love under will or something about love, right? He's basically saying do no harm, okay? And then also the Wiccans, who are demonized by Christians and also by, atheists for different reasons. But basically one of their main things is the saying, do what thou will, right? People say this and they say, oh, those Wiccans, they're so evil because they're just saying do whatever you want. But that's actually not even the entire sentence, right? The actual entire sentence is, if it harms nobody, comma, do what thou will, right? And people just leave that part out, okay? So that's just another example of demonizing the occult, and I think this was done on purpose. This is one of the ways to make something occult, is to make people think that it's bad, okay? And once they think it's bad, or once you've burned all the libraries and pulled all the books that have this information into your one library, like the Vatican Library and stuff like that, then you can get the people to do anything you want. You can design any type of civilization that you want because you know the truth and those people don't, okay? So anyways, I consider myself to be a de-occultist. I think the truth belongs to everyone. It is wrong to find something which is true and then to keep it to yourself to basically have an advantage over other people, okay? So basically, I think there's nothing wrong with the occult. The occult should be made unoccult. It should be de-occulted, and that's a phrase that I borrow from Mark Passio. He may be borrowing it from other people, but I basically consider myself to be a de-occultist. I think truth belongs to everyone, and my goal is to bring truth to you as close to the truth as possible, right? Of course, there are some things that I am wrong about, and I'm going to come to you and say it, and I'm going to believe it, but I may have been wrong at the time, and I may change my mind in the future, so you always have to keep in mind. But, I think it's pretty clear I am intelligent. I have looked into all of these types of things for many, many decades. So, intelligent, the capability to understand, the time put in to understand, and also the genuineness, right? The intention. What is the intention of the person, right? Is my intention, do you think there's any signs that my intention is to get an advantage over you in some way? I mean, if you look at my videos, I think it would be pretty hard for you to come to the conclusion that that's what I'm doing, okay? I really am just out here trying to bring you guys the truth as best as I can tell it is. And so, that's my mission. The occult is not bad. The only thing bad about it is that it's occulted, because it should be public knowledge. And of course, there are dangers that come along with that, but there's also, I think, more dangers that come along with allowing a small group of evil people to be the only ones who have this information. So anyways, hope that's useful, and I'll see you guys later.